Hi there. How's it going? Welcome back to another deep dive here at the Deep Dive. Today we're going to immerse ourselves in a really crucial topic for understanding the world right now. The shifting economic and geopolitical landscape. We'll be paying special attention to the, well, often tense relationship between the U.S. and China.
Exactly. And to guide us through this, we've drawn on a variety of recent sources that offer some, really valuable perspectives.
Right. We particularly want to mention the work of the analyst Jean Foucault. And his channel, he focuses on analysis, criteria, interpretation, common sense, and reflections, all in Spanish, which is quite interesting. His approach will sort of guide us as we explore this complex scene, using transcripts from channels like Alain Barroso Clips, Miguel Carrestias, and Solo Fonseca.
That's right. And our mission today really is to pull out the most important insights from these materials so you can grasp the depth of this power dynamic and maybe more importantly, what it actually means for you day to day. Understanding this relationship is just fundamental in the interconnected world we live in.
Okay, so if you're ready, let's start with a topic that's really defined the last few years and has been, at the epicenter of a lot of these tensions, the U.S.-China trade war. Let's cast our minds back to those initial moves, the tariff hikes under the Trump administration.
Yeah, absolutely. And initially, we saw those 25% tariffs, which in some cases climbed as high as 45% on certain goods imported from China.
And China hit back, didn't it?
Oh, yeah, predictably. They quickly responded by imposing their own 25% tariffs on a range of American products. At that point, there was even serious talk, about a potential complete breakdown of trade relations between the two powers.
What's fascinating, though, is watching Trump's posture evolve. At first, he seemed really firm, putting out messages like, "We are stronger." But then almost immediately, it felt like he was opening the door to negotiation.
While still keeping those 45% tariffs in place, right? It was a puzzling strategy, to say the least.
Heavily confusing.
And on that point, it's quite interesting what Victor Garcia de la Vega observed on Twitter. He suggested that behind all that tough talk, Trump was actually maybe waiting for China to call him to seek a deal,
Yeah.
driven perhaps by, personal ego.
And that interpretation kind of gains traction when you remember the reports, I think it was CNN, about the U.S. actually requesting a meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping.
Right. It seemed like that initial hard line was starting to waver a bit.
Cracks were appearing.
Cracks, which, as the analysis we've looked at suggest, ended up weakening the U.S. negotiating position, not just with China, but also with its traditional allies.
How so?
Well, the European Union, for example, started looking for alternatives, started looking more towards China because of the uncertainty generated by Trump's policies. It wasn't necessarily a sudden ideological shift, more like a pragmatic response to a partner who suddenly seemed, volatile.
Absolutely. And to really understand the roots of that potential long-term U.S. weakness, it's crucial to look at the industrial production capacity of both countries. And here, as our sources really highlight, the data is just staggering.
Yeah, brace yourself, because the numbers truly speak for themselves. China produces 13 times more steel than the U.S.
13 times.
13 times, which represents no less than 50% of global production. When it comes to cement, the difference is even starker. China produces 20 times more than the U.S.
Wow.
And in the chemical products sector, China, again, accounts for 50% of global production.
And if we look at manufacturing overall, the UN projections are pretty significant, aren't they?
They really are. They estimate that by 2025, China's share of the global manufacturing market will be double that of the U.S., and by 2030, 4 times larger.
That's a massive paradigm shift.
It doesn't stop there. In naval construction, shipbuilding, China has 200 times the capacity of the U.S., 200, also hitting 50% of global production.
Incredible.
In the auto industry, they produce 3 times more vehicles. And if we narrow it down to electric vehicles, EVs, China accounts for 67% of global production.
This dependency extends into sectors that are absolutely key for the future, like energy.
Exactly. In power generation, China produces double the electricity of the U.S. And in battery manufacturing, a critical component for the energy transition, they control 75% of global production. For solar panels, that figure jumps to 90%.
It's almost total dominance in those areas.
It's genuinely overwhelming. And in the tech sphere, like consumer drones, China produces 80%. One interesting point our analysts raise is the potential military implication of this huge drone production capacity.
Right, that dual-use potential.
Precisely. And just to complete the picture, regarding minerals and resources, China refines 90% of the world's rare earth minerals.
It's true that people often bring up nominal GDP as the key indicator of economic strength. And the U.S. might still hold an edge there on paper.
Sure, nominal GDP is one metric.
But these industrial production figures, they paint a very different picture, don't they? A more, maybe tangible view of real economic might. So how do we even get into this situation? What was the dominant economic model over the last few decades that led us here?
Well, for the last 30 years or so, basically since the 1980s, we've operated under a model you could roughly summarize as design in the West, produce in China, sell globally.
Okay.
The US and the Western world generally focused on innovation, design, marketing, distribution, while leaving the physical production, which often requires more labor and has thinner profit margins, to countries like China.
Apple's the classic example of this model, isn't it?
Mhm.
Designed in California, made in China, sold everywhere.
Exactly. And as the data we've seen points out, Apple keeps something like over 60% of the value of each iPhone, while China gets a much smaller fraction, maybe $10 to $15 for assembling each phone.
So Apple makes the lion's share.
Right. But what's crucial to understand here is that although it might look like the U.S. was losing out in this exchange at first glance, the reality is more complex. According to data from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, estimates suggest that over 50 cents of every dollar spent on Chinese goods actually returns to U.S. companies
Yeah.
through those activities we mentioned: design, marketing, distribution. So the value capture happened elsewhere in the chain.
So the wealth generated by this model wasn't really spread evenly within the U.S.
That's what our sources suggest. It seems to have disproportionately benefited a sort of oligarchy, particularly in the tech sector. And when we use that term oligarchy, in this context, we mean a small group of individuals or corporations, especially tech giants, who amass significant wealth and influence from this globalization model.
Which contradicts the narrative that the U.S. as a whole was the big loser. The big winners were figures maybe like Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos.
Precisely. And this brings us to a really critical turning point: the shift in the innovation paradigm. In 2022, China filed over 1.5 million patent applications globally.
1.5 million.
Over 1.5 million, far surpassing the U.S., which filed under 600,000 according to the World Intellectual Property Organization.
That's a radical turnaround. China isn't just the world's factory anymore. It's solidifying its position as its mine, too.
We're seeing these incredibly powerful innovation hubs emerging outside Silicon Valley cities like Shenzhen, Hangzhou, Beijing.
And Chinese companies are leading the charge in many sectors.
Absolutely. Think about Huawei, BYD in electric vehicles, Xiaomi, DJI in drones, Alibaba, TikTok. They're at the forefront of innovation in their respective fields. And as our analysis points out, this shift in intellectual property ownership is arguably one of the underlying reasons for the U.S. tariffs. It's become a fight for control not just of production, but of future technology itself.
It's a full-blown strategic battle.
Mhm.
And China isn't just sitting back, is it? It's starting to leverage its power in producing key materials as a strategic weapon.
That's right. We've seen China begin to restrict exports of high-tech materials with potential military applications, like gallium and germanium, specifically targeting the U.S. It's a strategic move to exert pressure and protect its lead in cutting-edge tech sectors.
And let's not forget their dominant position in processing rare earth minerals, controlling 90% of global production.
Exactly. Which raises serious questions about how effective U.S. tariffs on these critical materials can actually be, given that China has almost total control over the supply chain.
So who ends up footing the bill for these tariffs?
Largely, it's the end consumer. Let's take the Apple example we discussed earlier. Analysts are warning that if these tariffs are fully passed on, we could see the iPhone 16 Pro costing over, say, €10,000 in Spain, or the equivalent markup elsewhere. Even the base model could approach or exceed €1,000.
That's a huge price hike. It would hit consumers directly in the pocket. And it wouldn't just be Apple, right?
Right. No, not at all. You'd likely see similar impacts on Android devices and a whole range of tech products manufactured in China. The inevitable result would be a decrease in consumer purchasing power in Western countries and potentially, a reduction in overall spending.
This is where the irony really becomes quite striking.
Yeah.
Our sources mentioned the Trump store, Donald Trump's official merchandise shop,
Oh, yeah.
where many of the products bearing the Make America Great Again slogan clothing, accessories are actually labeled Made in China.
You're kidding. That's quite something.
It's a pretty glaring contradiction. And if you look at the U.S. trade deficit with China in goods, the numbers are stark.
Right.
Around $300 billion in 2024, with imports nearing $500 billion and exports hovering around $143.5 billion.
A massive imbalance and one that's been growing over time.
If you break down what the U.S. imports from China, it's mainly things like transmission equipment, computers, office machine parts, batteries, toys, vehicle parts, plastics, furniture.
Right. Consumer goods and components, largely.
Whereas the main U.S. exports to China are soybeans, petroleum, natural gas, cars, integrated circuits, machinery, vaccines, gas turbines, packaged medicines.
The trade balance is clearly unfavorable for the U.S., and critically, many of its key exports, like soybeans or gas, are things China could potentially source elsewhere. They're substitutable.
Exactly. China is by far the country with which the U.S. has its largest trade deficit, followed by Switzerland and Mexico, interestingly. This structural imbalance poses a significant challenge for the U.S. economy.
It really does.
Shifting gears slightly, but staying within this global context, it's interesting to look at the political reactions internationally. There was mention in some sources of a certain, maybe decadence is too strong a word, but a strange atmosphere in U.S. politics, exemplified by that staged-feeling press conference question about Trump's health.
Right. And internationally, Trump's tariff policies definitely provoked diverse reactions. You had someone like Giorgia Meloni in Italy, despite her initial alignment with Trump on some things, eventually calling his tariffs wrong.
Yet there were also voices defending them, like Santiago Abascal from Vox in Spain. He argued, somewhat uniquely, that the Spanish and European political caste were an even bigger tariff on citizens.
That's quite a take. The European Union, predictably, also considered retaliatory tariffs on U.S. products. And remember how Trump would temporarily pause tariffs for countries that didn't retaliate, while simultaneously hiking them up to, at one point, 125% on China?
It was a very dynamic, very volatile situation. And amidst this shifting geopolitical landscape, you also see moves like Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez visiting Vietnam and China, looking to strengthen trade ties.
A move which even prompted the U.S. Treasury Secretary to warn Spain about the potential risks of getting too close to China. It shows the pressure points.
Definitely. And this all kind of culminates, in a way, in that viral moment that really illustrates the irony of the whole situation.
Yeah.
The Made in China hat incident.
Ah, yes, that moment on Spanish TV, right, where a Chinese businesswoman pointed out that the Make America Great Again hat worn by a Trump supporter was in fact made in China.
The supporter's surprised expression was just priceless.
It's such a potent image, isn't it? It really highlights the disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality of global manufacturing. And as you mentioned, even Trump's own official store sells merchandise made in China.
So imposing tariffs would ultimately end up increasing the price of his own branded gear. The irony is layered.
Deeply layered.
Okay, well, after this deep dive, I think we can pull out some fundamental takeaways. China has firmly established itself not just as a manufacturing powerhouse, but increasingly as a leading innovator.
Absolutely. And the U.S.-China trade relationship is incredibly complex, full of contradictions, and these tariff policies have significant global ripple effects. What we're witnessing is a profound transformation of the global economic order, a kind of redistribution of production capabilities on a global scale.
China's moved beyond being just the low-cost labor force.
Right. It's increasingly becoming the mine as well as the hands of 21st century production.
And this brings us to a final thought for you, our listener. Considering China's growing technological and productive power and the global reactions it's provoking, what does all this suggest about the future of international trade and geopolitical alliances? What role will countries like yours play in this constantly evolving landscape?
It's an open question, definitely something to ponder. The dynamics we've explored today have really profound implications for all of us in this increasingly interconnected world.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. If you found this valuable, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more people. And of course, a like always helps the algorithm show this to a wider audience. We'll catch you on the next one. Hey there, how's it going? In today's deep dive, we're going to unpack a couple of really fascinating situations. They might seem quite different on the surface, but they actually share some key threads about trust, and transparency when it comes to public figures.
Absolutely.
And to kick things off, I actually wanted to mention the work of the analyst John Futal. If you haven't checked out his channel, maybe give it a look. He focuses on something really crucial these days: analysis, criteria, interpretation, common sense, basically reflection when trying to understand the info we get bombarded with.
That's so important. Yeah.
And you'll see how relevant that is for what we're about to explore.
Totally agree. I mean, with so much information swirling around, that ability to critically analyze stuff is, well, it's more necessary than ever, right?
Yeah.
And it's exactly that skill set that's going to help us understand these two situations we're looking at today.
Exactly. Because our first topic takes us straight into a case that, well, Futal would probably have a field day analyzing. It's about the legal troubles facing Elvis Perez, the newly elected member of the European Parliament.
Oh, yeah.
You might know him from his anti-corruption campaigns, maybe. But now he's actually smack bang in the middle of some controversy himself,
Yeah.
facing some pretty serious allegations.
Right.
We've been digging into reports from Alan Barroso clips and La Torreta Televisiva for this part, and the story is surprising, to say the least.
What really stands out here, don't you think, is the irony. Someone who pitches themselves as this anti-corruption crusader is now under investigation for, well, alleged financial crimes and spreading what looks like fake information.
Mhm.
It immediately makes you question, the authenticity of some of these narratives and maybe the real motivations behind certain political figures.
Okay, let's break this down then. Based on what we've seen, the Supreme Court in Spain has opened two separate criminal investigations into Alves Perez. One involves the alleged irregular financing of his political party,
Okay.
and the other is about spreading a fake COVID-19 test result for the former health minister, Salvador Illa.
Wow, two pretty significant legal fronts there. And if we connect that to what was shown on Alan Broso clips, the accusation about the irregular funding, that comes from a complaint filed by a businessman, Luis Ramillo, also known as Luis Crypto Spain.
That's the one.
Right. And this guy claims he gave Perez a hefty sum, 100,000 euros in cash during the European election campaign.
100 grand in cash. And according to this businessman, based on messages that have been made public, it seems Perez was specifically asking for funds that wouldn't have to go through the Court of Accounts oversight, to finance the party.
Mm-hmm.
The screenshot shown in that Alan Barroso clips video is pretty telling, actually.
What's fascinating here, and maybe, worrying for citizens, is the lack of transparency these messages suggest. A politician asking for funds outside the usual checks and balances, that immediately raises red flags about the legality, the ethics of those dealings, don't you think?
Totally. And it doesn't stop there. The judiciary's own website, potterjudicial.es, it lists the alleged crimes linked to this funding: illegal party financing, fraud, misappropriation, money laundering, and document forgery.
Oh,
That's quite a list.
that is a laundry list of serious accusations. I mean, it ranges from irregular money management right up to potentially major financial crimes. It really makes you wonder about the actual source of the campaign money and whether all the legal financial transparency rules, the ones required for all parties, were followed.
Plus, there's this other detail that catches the eye. Alves Perez had promised to raffle off his MEP salary every month.
Yeah.
He did it, what, once or twice?
Yeah, something like that.
But, as mentioned in the Alan Barroso clips video, after a natural disaster in Valencia, he stopped, saying he was going to donate the money to help those affected instead.
Yeah.
Since then, crickets. Nothing more about that promise.
Yeah, that raises an interesting question about consistency, doesn't it, between words and actions? Was it a genuine promise or more of a campaign tactic that got dropped once the votes were in? The fact that there's been no more information about where that money went, it casts doubt on his original intentions, wouldn't you say?
And of course, by getting elected as an MEP, Perez gained what's known as aforamiento parliamentary immunity, which means any criminal proceedings against him have to go through the Supreme Court. That's something highlighted in La Torreta Televisiva, too.
Right. That legal status, the immunity tied to the Supreme Court, it adds a significant layer of legal complexity. It means the country's highest court has to handle the case because of his MEP position. For, regular citizens watching, it just means the process could be longer and more complicated.
Okay, let's shift to the second legal issue. Spreading that fake PCR test of Salvador Illa during the Catalan elections. This was covered by both Alan Barroso clips and La Torreta Televisiva, and there was also confirmation from the Quirónsalud Hospital itself.
Ah, yes. This one brings us right into the frankly worrying issue of fake news and just how easily false information spreads, especially during, tense political times. Forging a document like a PCR test, aside from being a crime itself, can seriously damage the targeted person's reputation and just poison the public debate.
And the thing is, as they discussed in the Alan Barroso clips video, once a lie gets out there, it's incredibly hard to completely stop it. Even if it's proven false later, the initial damage is often done.
Exactly. The speed information travels today, especially on social media, makes spreading fake news a huge problem. This case really underscores how crucial it is for public figures to be responsible with the information they share.
On top of these two criminal investigations, the European Parliament itself sanctioned Perez, docking him 2 days' worth of allowances for not declaring his income, as mentioned in Alan Barroso clips. Another blow to that transparent image he was trying to project.
Yeah, that sanction from the parliament, even if it seems kind of small, it hits directly at that issue of transparency for elected officials. Declaring income is just a basic rule, right? To ensure accountability and prevent potential conflicts of interest.
And going back to the businessman, Luis Ramillo, in the Alain Barroso clips video, he's extremely critical of Perez now. He actually calls him a corrupt bargain, I'm translating loosely here, for allegedly soliciting and accepting that 100,000 euros piece of organize.
Strong words. The testimony from the person who supposedly handed over the money adds a very personal, very direct angle to these corruption allegations. The fact that this person is now apparently cooperating with the authorities makes Perez's legal situation even more precarious.
So here we see, like Jean Foutol emphasizes, the importance of applying critical thinking and common sense to the information we get, especially from those who present themselves as, squeaky clean. But okay, let's switch gears completely now. We're heading across the Atlantic to look at another situation that's also stirring up a lot of uncertainty. The escalating trade tensions between the U.S. and China under Donald Trump. Right. For this, we've drawn on a really interesting video from the Mexican family titled Attack Final Day China. Trump no aguanta el golpe y tel 125%.
This second topic gives us a clear example of how certain political decisions can have major economic ripple effects, sometimes even causing problems for the country making them. Tariff hikes and trade responses between the world's two biggest economies. That has a global impact that affects, well, pretty much everyone, directly or indirectly.
Okay, let's dive into this one too. According to the Mexican family, Trump repeatedly imposed tariffs on Chinese goods. It started at 85%, then jumped to 125%, and eventually hit 145%.
And predictably, China retaliated with similar tariffs on imports from the U.S., also reaching that 125% mark. This tit-for-tat escalation caused a lot of anxiety in financial markets worldwide.
Oh, you bet it did. The Mexican family video really highlights the negative impact on U.S. markets. Big drops in the Dow Jones and the S&P 500, plus the dollar weakened. Even Janet Yellen, former Fed chair, slammed these policies, calling them, I think, the worst self-inflicted wound by an administration.
The market reaction is such a key indicator, isn't it? It shows the level of uncertainty and worry these trade policies generated, falling stock indexes, a weaker currency that reflects the perception that economic risk was shooting up.
Another interesting point they mention is the rise in the price of gold, which is traditionally seen as a safe haven asset during unstable economic times.
Right. The gold price going up is usually read as a sign that investors are scrambling for safer assets when things feel uncertain economically or financially. It's like they're seeking shelter for their money.
And there was criticism that these policies were rolled out without really consulting U.S. allies, who just added to the nervousness in the global economy.
Yeah, that lack of coordination with traditional trading partners definitely eroded confidence in the stability of the whole international economic system. It created extra diplomatic tensions, too. For the average person, this can translate into more economic volatility globally.
There was that brief moment when Trump put a pause on new tariffs, except for China's, and the markets initially reacted positively. But as the Mexican family points out, that relief didn't last long because people realized the underlying problems hadn't actually been solved.
That initial market bounce on the tariff pause shows how sensitive traders are to news, but the quick correction afterwards just signals that the big issues, especially the confrontation with China, were still very much there.
The video also touches on the impact on specific companies like Tesla, suggesting a possible dip in sales might be linked to Elon Musk's perceived closeness to Trump's policies at the time.
That connection between the political views of some business leaders and their company's performance is always an interesting angle. In this case, Musk's perceived alignment with Trump might have potentially swayed how some consumers viewed the Tesla brand.
Okay, and this is where things get, let's say, a bit murky. The Mexican family raises the possibility that a small group might have actually profited financially from all this market instability, hinting at potential insider trading.
Yeah, the idea that some investors might have used non-public information to make money during a period of economic uncertainty, that raises serious ethical and legal questions about market integrity.
They mentioned a specific tweet from Trump encouraging people to buy stocks right before he announced that tariff pause, and how the market rallied shortly after.
The timing overlap between Trump's public message and the market movement certainly prompts questions about whether there was an intent to influence stock prices.
And not just that, they talk about a suspicious spike in call options for major ETFs, like the SPY and QQQ, right before the pause was announced. These ETFs, just for context, are like baskets holding shares of many top companies.
Those kinds of unusual movements in the options market, especially for such widely traded instruments, could suggest that some traders might have had advanced knowledge of Trump's upcoming decisions.
Senator Bernie Sanders even called for an investigation into whether Trump and his inner circle used privileged information for personal gain.
A call for an investigation from a senator like Sanders really underscores how serious those suspicions were and the need to clarify if any market manipulation actually occurred.
All of this has fueled growing skepticism about Trump's economic expertise, even among some former supporters and within Wall Street itself.
Yeah, confidence in Trump's ability to manage the economy definitely took a hit because of the instability his policies created, and also because of these suspicions about potentially unethical behavior.
And as if the trade tensions with China weren't enough, Trump also used the issue of water with Mexico as another pressure point, as discussed in the Mexican family.
Using trade disputes or natural resource issues like water as political leverage, that's a strategy that can have really significant consequences for international relations and regional stability.
Trump accused Mexico of stealing water from Texas, referencing a water treaty signed back in 1944.
Bringing up a decades-old treaty during a major drought really raises questions about how these old agreements apply in today's changing climate conditions.
And the thing is, as the video explains, both the U.S. and Mexico are grappling with severe drought conditions, making Trump's demands almost impossible to meet realistically.
Yeah, in situations where a resource like water is scarce, cooperation and flexibility in applying agreements are usually key to avoiding conflict and finding fair solutions for everyone involved.
The Mexican family also points out that in past droughts, both countries have managed to cooperate and be flexible in how they applied the treaty.
History shows that the U.S. and Mexico have found ways to work together and adapt during water scarcity crises before.
So all this suggests Trump might have been using the water dispute as another lever, maybe to exert pressure or perhaps distract from other issues.
Yeah, using a natural resource dispute for political ends could potentially divert attention from more pressing problems and just create unnecessary friction between the two countries.
Furthermore, the Mexican family puts forward the idea that Trump's tariffs were effectively taxes paid by American consumers, essentially being used to try and pay down the national debt.
That interpretation of tariffs as indirect taxes on citizens highlights the potential hidden costs of protectionist policies.
There was even criticism from within the Republican Party about the potential negative political fallout from Trump's trade policies in upcoming elections, recalling past instances where tariffs arguably led to electoral losses.
The fact that there was concern within Trump's own party about the political effects of his economic policies just underscores that there wasn't a unified view, and there was real uncertainty about whether these strategies were effective long term.
They also mentioned the internal squabbles within Trump's economic advisory team, with different camps holding opposing views on tariffs.
The existence of those differing opinions right inside Trump's economic team with conflicting views on trade policy really reflects a lack of a clear, unified strategy.
Elon Musk, publicly criticizing Peter Navarro, who was a key architect of Trump's tariffs, is another sign of that disarray.
That kind of public clash between influential figures like Musk and Navarro really highlights the divisions within Trump's inner circle and the lack of consensus on crucial economic issues.
And just to wrap up this point, the report mentions Trump actually reversing some semiconductor tariffs he'd imposed, which further illustrates the somewhat erratic nature of his policies.
Rolling back some tariffs suggests either a lack of conviction or maybe a response to internal or external pressures, adding yet more uncertainty about the direction of U.S. trade policy.
So we see how both Alviz Perez's legal troubles and the controversies around Donald Trump's economic policies make us think about these big themes: trust, transparency, and the potential for powerful people to act in self-serving ways. It's absolutely crucial, as Jean Foucault reminds us, to critically analyze the information coming at us from all sources.
Absolutely. That ability to discern, to question, and to seek out different viewpoints is just essential for each of us to form an informed opinion and avoid being swayed by, self-serving narratives.
Well, with that final thought, we're reaching the end of our deep dive for today.
It's been quite an intense look at two complex situations with a lot of implications for everyone.
It really has. And now, to sign off, o si estás escuchando esto, suscríbete, que lo tienes por aquí debajo, es completamente gratuito y por supuesto, regálame tu like para que este video llegue a muchas más personas.